Welcome to this panel, which is called Ways of Knowing the City. And we have three speakers. I'll tell you a bit about them in a moment. And we have a dynamic format, which I'll also explain. But first, a little bit about the topic. Affect and experience and a rich array of sensory information will always be essential parts of knowing a city. Modern media and the city are closely intertwined. Film is like the kinetics of experience in the city with its new forms of modern transport. Photography is like a glimpse, a vignette, a framed moment. In the 19th century, French poet Charles Baudelaire imagined the persona of a flaneur, a stroller, someone who walked the city in order to experience it and to take in fleeting expressions and to be simultaneously part of and apart from the crowd. And these observations would be social and aesthetic. So Baudelaire's flaneur has had a long afterlife as a figure for urban life and even for modernity itself, and the flaneur anticipates street photography and even tourism. Cities function as keepers of cultural and historical memory as well. Scholar Andreas Huissen posits cities as palimpsests of history, incarnation of time in stone, sites of memory extending both in time and space. And Italo Calvino, in his novel from 1972, Invisible Cities, wrote that, quote, "The city does not tell its past, but contains it like the lines of a hand, written in the corners of the streets, the gratings of the windows, the banisters of the steps, the antennae of the lightning rods, the poles of the flags, every segment marked in turn with scratches, indentations, and scrolls." Our understanding of city environments will always be intertwined with the development of literature, film, photography, and newer media as artistic modes. Today, in this first panel, we will ask how we can connect these nuanced humanistic perspectives and their document of human experience with new forms of media and big data that investigate the modern urban experience and produce new forms of knowledge using powerful new tools and conceptual paradigms. How do the non-human and the human intersect in urban environments today? Collectively, we'll try to make some headway on this topic in panel one. This panel lasts in total for an hour and a half. First, we'll have presentations, about 15 minutes each, from our three speakers, who are, in the order in which they'll present, Heidi Ewing, who's a filmmaker and co-director of the Emmy-awarding film Detropia, a documentary about the contemporary state of her hometown, Detroit, which premiered at the Sundance Festival in 2012. Mark Shepard, professor of architecture and media studies from the University of Buffalo, a practitioner and a theorist who explores in his work the complex notion of the sentient city. We tend to think of people as being sentient, but in fact, cities can be. And finally, Sooni Taraporevala, the photographer, screenwriter, and director, and her photography exhibition, Home in the City, Bombay 1976 to Mumbai 2016, is currently showing at the Whitworth Gallery in Manchester, England, and has been listed as one of the top 5 art exhibitions in the United Kingdom by The Guardian. So after the panelists have completed their presentations, I will moderate a short discussion among them for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session where members of the audience can come to the mic that will be in the central aisle and ask questions of the presenters themselves. So, with no further ado, I suggest that we get started, and I invite Heidi Ewing to the podium to give her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you to Liz and to Radcliffe and everyone here for taking an interest in cities and urbanism. I think it's funny that Angela mentioned the need for confessions when we talk about cities. It's very true about Detroit. So my confession, I actually grew up 20 minutes north of Detroit. It's very important. And my father was a Detroiter, and my parents were part of the so-called white flight out of Detroit. after the uprisings, riots, however you'd like to call it, in 1967. My granny from the north side of Detroit refused to leave till she couldn't get up her stairs at the end. Her body gave out. She used to proudly call herself the last white lady on the block. That's my confession. So, as a documentary director, I make a living following the stories of real people and with my camera capturing the change and, well, you hope there's going to be change and evolutions over a period of time. And what I've learned in my career so far is that narratives are very, very powerful. A narrative is a powerful tool. In the film Detropia, which is one of my films from 2012, I had the chance to chronicle the narrative of an entire place, or attempt to chronicle the narrative of an entire place, which would be the city of Detroit. And during the production of this film, something unexpected happened. Before my eyes, the conversation about Detroit completely changed. From the time I began shooting the film in 2009 to its theatrical release in 2012, the local narrative, meaning the story that the Detroit residents themselves told themselves about their city, began to clash with the national narrative, which by that I mean the way in which outsiders and the media chose to see the city. And this sort of happened, I guess, by coincidence while we were making the film. So I'd like to start with the Time magazine cover. So this was 2009. This was when I began Detropia. Soon after, this Time magazine published the cover story, The Tragedy of Detroit. The article described Detroit as a place that looked as if it had, quote, been savaged by a hurricane or submerged by a ravenous flood, unquote. Why hadn't the world noticed? The article asked. To me, who grew up in the Detroit metro area, Time was simply mimicking what we had been shouting for years, what we knew all along. Segregation, racial inequality, subpar education, massive governmental corruption at the local level, an auto industry that had refused to change, a city that refused to diversify. Crime was wild, jobs had vanished. We knew these things already. The article was not a shock. But the nation seemed shocked. This got a lot of attention, this Time magazine cover. There was a lot of recoverage on it. But the interesting thing is we locals, we Detroiters and Metro Detroiters, my father was in manufacturing, so this was very close to our hearts, what was happening to Detroit. We had another narrative, a counter-narrative, perhaps, that we told about our own city. And that was one very close to our hearts. And it was a story of deep pride in Detroit's place in history. To us, in symbolic terms at the very least, Detroit was the most important place in America. And when I started shooting Detropia, I found that that narrative was still alive. And so I'd like to show you a clip from the film. This is one of my subjects, George McGregor, president of United Auto Workers, Local 22.
During World War II, America was like, wow. We built war machines for the world, right? Right over here where I hired in at Fleetwood. They turned that from an automobile factory to building airplanes, right there on 4th Street. We built everything and put them on a ship and shipped them to England and everywhere. Y'all know what we did. Keep up with that history. Huh? Now we can't even buy an American-made washing machine or an iron. So where did all our manufacturing base go? Where did it all go? Because we built everything. We built everything. Everything. America did. We have a standard of living in America that the working guy provided, a standard of living, which is eroding now, but it's a standard of living that the working guy, and it started right here in Detroit. Right here in Detroit, a middle class started right here. Everybody know it. We just got to face up to it. So we're able to send our kids to school. We're able to set up a little bit of money. Some of our guys were able enough to get a little place up north or whatever. Middle class. Got a boat. You understand what I'm saying? Middle class. Middle class. Leave it to Beaver. the White House, the picket fence. Leave it to me. Wasn't that the middle class? Come on now. We're looking at it on TV, right? Weren't we? Then we see it come into our lives. There it is, the middle class.
I love that guy. George McGregor, you know, what a way to synthesize the feelings that a lot of us have and a lot of Detroiters still have about the place and the importance of Detroit. You know, hearkening back to Angela's talk, you know, he is a product of the Great Migration. His family was from the South and came up to work in the factories, he included, you know, black middle class. He's you know, evidence of it. Anyway, my parents and grandparents all sounded like George. Detroit's role in the creation of the middle-class lifestyle should be honored and cherished. This narrative acted as a type of urban institutional memory shared by natives of the city. But what I found most surprising while making Detropia is that this strong connection to history, which is not that, we don't find that very often in 20-somethings right now, but this strong connection to history was still prevalent even among the youngest Detroiters I met, who had never experienced not even a moment of this heyday that we always heard about. Even for them, Detroit remained thick with nostalgia for the elusive past. And I'd never seen people in their 20s feel so old and talk so old and have such a grasp and nostalgia for an era that they never lived. And that I found over and over while making Detropia. And that brings us to Crystal and how she interacted with her own city. She was in her mid-20s when we met her. She was born and raised in Detroit. She was one of the residents that could easily have left, but had chosen to stay. And all the characters in the film Detropia could have left that we focus on and chose to stay, and that's very significant. But the city had too much of a grip on her, and the past had too much of a grip on her for her to leave. And she used to go, when she wasn't waiting tables, she would do urban explorations, and she would break into old buildings and try to figure out who lived there and what life had been like. So I'd like to show Crystal at Lee Plaza from Detropia.
July 4th, 2010, Independence Day. I'm going real revolutionary. We're in a beautiful building. History is just one of my things, even since grade school. Are you shitting? That's a passion. What was there? Who was there? These hallways, though, I mean, I'm picturing this place clean and there being, you know, people walking around and shit happening. Bring that shit on up here, girl. Wow, it's amazing where you see where they just ripped out the wall because there's copper piping right there. Can you imagine like having breakfast right here? You know what I mean? Like, look at your view. Look at your view in the morning. Like, yeah, I'm gonna go out and conquer the world because I can damn near see it from right here. Motown right up the street. Can't leave, man. Can't fucking leave. I feel like I was maybe here a little while back. or I'm older than I really am, but I just have like this young body and spirit and mind, but I have the memory of this place when it was banging. That's how I feel.
So I found people like Crystal over and over again while making Detropia that were haunted by the past, something I didn't expect to find while making the film. Crystal had every reason to believe that she was the last person on Earth that was interested in all these empty blocks of her city, but that assumption was very wrong. As we know, the 2008 market crash landed plenty of young college grads back in their parents' basements, maybe in some of your basements. Rumors of $500 houses, large lofts for artists, and quasi-lawless city in search of residents sounded pretty appealing to some people. The newcomers, who were mostly young, single, and white, came with no malice to Detroit, yet they also came with little to no appreciation or understanding of Detroit's past, including its very charged racial past. They preferred to talk about the new trendy ideas like large-scale urban farming, which was a major idea being floated in Detroit, or to start microbreweries or graphic design firms. They were not interested in pondering all that had been lost before. They were not haunted by the past of Detroit. Detroit gained 14,000 white residents between 2010 and 2014. It was the first uptick like that in 60 years. This attitude that a lot of them had, which was that Detroit was a blank slate or an empty canvas. This idea crept in. Detroit was almost their petri dish for experimentation of all kinds. The new narrative was that Detroit could be almost a playground for young whites, and they could live cheaply and well. And here's an example of that. These are two artists that we met that are in the film Detropia, Steve and Dorota Coy. This is sort of just after they moved into the city. The Coys' Detropia, please.
Dorota and I met in Hawaii. We knew we weren't going to stay in Hawaii, so we were just tossing around places. We wanted to be somewhere urban, of course. We had a project that we wanted to do, like street art, public installation. And so we just started evaluating, we looked at Baltimore, we were looking into New York City, and Detroit came up. And I knew that's one thing Detroit had an abundance of, was space and old warehouses. I feel like we've assimilated into that community of artists that are moving here and coming here.
That's pretty sweet.
Never had appliances this nice, so I feel like I should be taking care of them. Yeah, we bought it just a couple weeks ago. And we're able to keep our studio because everything's so affordable. Yeah, Detroit is always constantly amazing me. I feel like this is it's redefining what the value of things are. $25,000 for an amazing loft. I don't know, that just makes it accessible to people like me. I would never be able to afford to own a home as an artist. And here I am, with a studio and an apartment in a major city, functioning for like $700 or less a month. We can experiment here, because if we fail, we haven't really fallen anywhere.
So you see the difference in the newcomers and the old-timers there, and at first, Detroiters reacted with curiosity and skepticism at the newcomers and their embrace of this new Detroit that they could see. And there was some humorous headlines. My favorite headline was from the Detroit Metro Times that was reacting to these carpetbaggers, and it said, "Major cities unloading undesirable hipsters in Detroit." Can I see the billboard Bushwick, please? And you know, there was sort of a little advertising. This is in Bushwick, New York, and Brooklyn. It's like you're going to be a hipster and have a hipster's life. You can live cheaper and better if you come to Detroit. There was also this graffiti campaign, Move to Detroit, which you would see on the bridges. And this was not a massive campaign, but it goes to show that sort of this looking at Detroit in a completely different way. And suddenly it sort of had a street cred. A lot of New York Times articles and the like were obsessed with these young white newcomers. Endless articles about them and what were they doing there and would they help save the city and all of that sort of thing. So this comeback narrative of Detroit started to arise. And you know, it's really interesting because the corporations really soon followed all of this coverage. In 2011, just as Detroit entered bankruptcy proceedings, Shinola, the fancy watch and bike company, set up shop in the city. Their pitch was that by purchasing a $550 watch or a $3,000 bicycle, hip consumers could buy into the revival of one of America's great industrial cities. So corporations and investors really heard the call. Dan Gilbert, the owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers and Quicken Loans, began to scoop up a lot of these skyscrapers that had been long emptied and fill them with luxury lofts. In 2013, Whole Foods came to town and was greeted with a full-fledged frenzy. The city had arrived. Whole Foods was there. So the rebranding of Detroit's national narrative had been sort of complete. But had the city actually improved, and for whom? And who does this revitalization benefit? Well, here are the facts, just numbers. Detroit has been #1 on Forbes' most dangerous cities list now for 4 years in a row. Detroit only has enough jobs to employ roughly 37% of the population. The public school remains in a disgrace. On the whole, black residents, which make up over 80% of the city, have not benefited from this new Detroit. A very small area called Midtown in the downtown area, you see restaurants, you see galleries, you see more tourists. You do see an economy coming through here, but the rest of the 140 square miles remains exactly as I've always remembered it since I was a child. Detroit declared bankruptcy in 2013. Today, still the population continues to decline. However, they think that by 2018, the population, the endless decline might actually bottom out. And that is significant. It's not insignificant. But narratives are powerful. When I started Detropia, people would ask what I was working on. I'd say, I'm spending a lot of time in Detroit, and they would always answer, I'm sorry to hear that. A little snide remark, oh, Detroit-lit, and things like that. Now when I say I'm going back to Detroit for the weekend, they say, oh my God, cool, I heard it's back now, and I'm dying to go check it out. And maybe that narrative, the Detroit phoenix rising from the ashes, will someday become a reality. Perhaps Detroit's affordability and strange allure will continue to bring more people to the city, people like yourselves, with good ideas of how a greater number of Detroiters can actually benefit from this new interest in investment in the city. We're far off from this, I feel, but the fascination with Detroit continues to grow, and somehow the city has a hold on us. In fact, writer Drew Phillips likes to say Detroit is the most interesting city on the planet because when you scratch the surface, you only find a mirror. There's just something about this city, about this story, we cannot shake. So I hope you continue to explore it, and thank you so much for having me.
So thank you first, of course, to the organizers, to Eve, to Julie, to Eric, and you know, naturally to Dean Cohen for consistently supporting what seems to have been an incredible run here in the Radcliffe Institute. I'd like to especially thank Eve Blau, who was the protagonist in bringing me here last year to this workshop on urban intermedia, which provided an impetus for me to organize my thoughts around this issue of how what we know about the city is conditioned through the lens with which we see it, and subsequently, how that lens in turn conditions us. You know, it's fortuitous to follow Heidi, I think, in the sense that what I'm going to talk about is, in a sense, the other side of what might be described as the power of personal narrative to articulate a place and how we read a city through people, right? And I think you know, we, in the keynote, heard quite a bit about this notion that people define cities, which then in turn define people. So it's this relationship that I'm interested in. And I'm interested in looking forward in terms of how contemporary modes of observing the city, and this, in particular, the role of big data, algorithms, and so-called intelligent urban infrastructure, are shaping what we know about the city today, and how, in turn, it's beginning to shape us. And my interest here lies in questioning how this reciprocal relationship between the methods and objects of urban research changes when we shift from employing representational tools by which the present city is observed to methods involving data mining and analysis that aim to derive observations and make predictions about future situations. So this is primarily a story about shifting focus from deploying representational tools such as the film camera as instruments for recording or for urban observation to instrumenting physical environments themselves and ultimately the people that inhabit them with sensors and software systems to quantify urban life in ways that claim to lead to ever more optimized, efficient, and sustainable cities. Now, devices for observing the world have been around for a while. Much has been said about the camera obscura, for instance, and its role in recording geometrically accurate views of the city. These are 4 drawings by Canaletto representing the Campo San Giovanni e Paolo in Venice, produced with the aid of a camera obscura, resulting in studies for this painting. And as historian Jonathan Crary has noted, the camera obscura can be understood not only as a performative device, which is to say a tool for representing an urban space, for example, but also as an epistemological model that articulates a relationship between an observer and the world. Here we find the construction of a monocular subject, isolated and ensconced within a dark room, to which the world is gathered as image through a pinhole oculus and projected onto an interior wall of an observational device. Now, if we compare this device with that of the stereoscope, a different story and a different emerging observing subject emerges. As a byproduct of early 19th century advances in physiological optics, the stereoscope capitalized on the discovery that with binocular vision, each eye sees something slightly differently due to the angular disparity existing between them. The production of depth in sight was subsequently understood to be in some way related to the mind's ability to unite and reconcile 2 dissimilar images. Within this context, the stereoscope was developed to reproduce this optical experience mechanically. Now, significantly, the device marks an intent not just to represent a given space, but actually to simulate its presence. Right? What is sought is not merely a likeness, but a lucid tangibility. With the stereoscope, one is confronted not with a view of the world through an aperture or a frame, but rather with the technical reconstitution of an already reproduced world fragmented into 2 non-identical models. Through the incorporation of an observing subject into the mechanics of the device, the stereoscopic image is subsequently produced. The body is immobilized and integrated with the apparatus. The subject becomes a participant in the production of a verisimilitude through a process of unifying and reconciling the experience of difference. This disjunction between an experience and its cause is reified, the real conflated with the optical. Absent is the notion of a point of view in a Cartesian sense, as might be characterized by the camera obscura. There is, in the end, nothing out there. So the radical differences between these pre-cinematic devices highlight the role of the apparatus in constituting not only the parameters of what we know about the world, but also how we conceive our relationship to it, and ultimately, how we know the world and locate our agency to act within it. Now, fast forward to late 20th century urban observations and the work of William White and his Street Life project, which aimed to study how people behave and interact within urban environments and with urban environments through a structured research protocol that aspired to empirical observations, in this case involving time-lapse photography. This is a photograph of the apparatus in question, a Super 8 film camera, and a clock, which was persistently in the frame. Now, I'd like to play for you a short excerpt from his film, The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces, which documents the project and distills a few observations from the results.
This is the plaza of the Seagram building in New York, late morning. With a time-lapse camera, we were testing a hypothesis. The sun, we were pretty sure, would be the chief factor in determining where people would sit or not sit. Now, just after 12, they begin to sit, right where the sun is. I was enormously pleased. What a perfectly splendid correlation. It was quite misleading, as we were to see later, but it was a very encouraging way to start.
So this notion, I want you to hold on to this notion of misleading correlations. What's important here is that the project departs from a set of hypotheses about how people interact and behave within small urban spaces and deploys the filmic apparatus in a structured way to test these hypotheses. This is what we might characterize today as a small data study, which is to say small data being characterized by their generally limited volume, their non-continuous collection, their narrow variety, and usually generated to answer very specific questions. You start with a question about a space and what people are doing there. Now, I'd like you to compare White's apparatus with this. These are two smartphones affixed to windows recording activity happening on a street outside, in this case in Manhattan as well. And this is a demo clip from a startup called Placemeter. And Placemeter is a service that deploys crowdsourced smartphones as video sensors for monitoring activity on city sidewalks and public spaces in cities around the world. These video feeds are analyzed in real time based on computer vision algorithms. And they process activity in the video frame based on a set of predefined classifiers established through AI and machine learning algorithms. Here's how Placemeter presents itself.
If you could measure urban areas the same way you do with page views on the web, you'd have enough data to make better decisions about your community, meaning stronger businesses, better neighborhoods, and more livable cities. Placemeter does just that. It's an urban intelligence platform. It processes videos from its own easy-to-install sensor, existing camera systems, or even pre-recorded video. It analyzes pedestrian and vehicular movements and turns them into meaningful data for municipalities and businesses worldwide. This way, retailers can optimize storefronts and operations for physical stores. Commercial realtors can provide clients with solid proof and analysis of foot traffic potential. And municipalities can make smarter decisions with public money, delivering better services and safer streets to all. Start quantifying your world today at placemeter.com.
Quantify your world today for free, at least the demo. So in contrast to White's method, which deploys time-lapse photography in an attempt to test a set of hypotheses about how people inhabit urban space, Placemeter employs big data analytics in an attempt to make discoveries and derive hypotheses from patterns of movement and activity, quantifying the life of the street in terms of a set of pre-established classifiers. Former editor-in-chief of Wired magazine, Chris Anderson, has described this new era of big data analytics as a new era of knowledge production characterized by the end of theory. In other words, big data analytics enables an entirely new epistemological approach for making sense of the world. Rather than testing a theory by gathering and analyzing relevant data as White did, big data analytics seems to gain insights that are born from the data. Okay, but what are big data? Rob Kitchen, in his book, The Data Revolution, identifies a series of characteristics which help frame it. Now, big data are huge in volume, they are high in velocity, they are diverse in a variety of type, they are exhaustive in scope, In other words, you're not dealing with a sample size of a subset, but you're actually attempting to get the entire population as a subset, as your data set. They're fine-grained in resolution. They are relational in nature, and they are flexible, holding the traits of extensionality and scalability. Now, currently, PlaceLab is being deployed in Paris to study urban design proposals for renovating urban traffic services and traffic circles into more pedestrian-friendly zones in the city. They do things like studying how these park benches are used or not used, bike paths, widths, and so forth. But this trend here is toward instrumenting physical environments with sensors and employing big data analytics to quantify urban life in ways that are characteristics of many, many so-called smart city initiatives, which we're seeing pop up around the world. From the Songdo International Business District in South Korea, also known as New Songdo, which is a new city built from scratch by a partnership between New York-based developer Gale International and the New York office of Kohn Pedersen Fox, as well as Cisco Systems, the digital plumbers, so to speak. To Masdar City in the United Arab Emirates, developed by the Mubadala Development Company in association with British architecture firm Foster and Partners. To Hudson Yards in New York, a partnership between related companies, Oxford Properties and the New York office of Kohn Pedersen Fox. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about Hudson Yards. When completed, this $20 billion project will span 7 city blocks on the west side of Manhattan. It's literally the largest real estate development project ever undertaken in the US. It will incorporate more than 18 million square feet of commercial and residential space, including 100 retail shops, 4,000 residences, and 14 acres of parks and public plazas. This massive development effort promises to showcase the latest smart city technologies, promising the world's first connected, responsive, clean, responsible, reliable, and efficient neighborhood. Right? Who wouldn't want that? Who would want to live in a dumb city? The project also pretends to be the world's first quantified community, a literal testbed for experiments in urban data science led by NYU's Center for Science and Urban Progress, or CUSP. Konstantin Kontokosta, CUSP's project leader, describes the quantified community as a fully instrumented urban neighborhood that uses an integrated, expandable sensor network to support the measurement, integration, and analysis of neighborhood conditions, activity, and outcome. So they're doing things like measuring, modeling, and predicting pedestrian flows, gauging air quality, both within buildings and across open spaces, measuring and modeling energy production and usage throughout the project, measuring health and activity levels of residents and workers using a custom-designed opt-in mobile application. Now, how many people in this room are familiar with the quantified self movement? Not many. Okay, few. So the notion of a quantified community stems from the idea of the quantified self, which simply involves people logging personal data about their daily activities using wearable sensors. You might have heard the device, a Fitbit, for example. Apps such as fitness activity trackers, for example, monitor a range of health factors, heart rate, steps taken, floors climbed, calories burned, even sleep quality, and produce representations of our progress towards self-identified goals that are shared and aggregated through online portals. Here, the notion is that through the continuous self-monitoring of physiological conditions, we can bring about personal behavioral change. We can change our behavior if we just know enough in quantifiable terms about what the data is. Now, scaling this paradigm to the neighborhood, the quantified community then, is the idea that continuous monitoring of the built environment, the status of its technical systems, and human activity all can be fed back into that environment to alter its future performance and ultimately the behavior of its inhabitants. Here, people engage with their neighborhood not only by consuming its services and administering its systems, but also by serving as sources of measurable behavioral data. People in this context become sensors. They become themselves sensors. Now, and Shannon Matern has done some interesting work on this, article in Places Journal Online recently, actually about a year ago now, and where she identifies some of the key problems here. Yet if we were to measure the behavior of these citizen censors as an index of the engagement with the city, we'd find that their actions, in fact, are limited by the instruments that render those actions visible and worth accounting for, right? And she references Hannah Arendt here, saying, you know, the trouble with modern theories of behavioralism, and this is Arendt in 1958 in her book, The Human Condition, is not that they're wrong, but that they could become true, that the very instruments used to measure behavior are indicative of and constitutive of societies of automatism and sterile passivity. So the data that we generate, based on determinist assumptions and faulty methodologies in some cases, could end up shaping populations and building worlds in their own image, right? So the quantified community at Hudson Yards thus can be seen as a testbed for future urban life, where urban intelligence, the so-called smartness of the smart city, is rendered not as conscious, liberal, or objective, but rather as performative. In the shift from observational tools to environments that observe, both the city and its citizens converge into populations of human and non-human actors and actants that comprise not individual bodies and personal experiences, but rather patterns of activity and behavior iteratively mined and interpreted by algorithmic processes. Now, this testbed world of big data, a world where correlation supersedes causation, is a probabilistic one where few things are certain and most are only probable, such as the relationship between cheese consumption and the number of people being tangled in their bed sheets. It presents an urban epistemology that's not concerned with documenting facts, representing spaces, or making representative models of our world, but rather creating models that are in and of themselves territories. So the question is what questions do we need to be asking about these new territories? Dalton and Thatcher have argued for a new field of critical data studies that situates these territories in broader social, cultural, and political contexts, and that address the technical, ethical, political, and economic, temporal, spatial, and philosophical implications of this shift from observational tools to observing environments. And in closing, I'd like to transpose their so-called 5 questions at the end of that essay to urban environments. And in doing so, we might ask, what historical conditions have led to the instrumentation of cities with big data systems and infrastructures? How is big data being deployed or employed in the production of urban space and infrastructure? Who controls the production and analysis of big data in urban environments? What implicit and explicit biases, motives, and imperatives drive their work? Who are the urban subjects of big data, and what new forms of knowledge are they producing? And ultimately, what productive insights can urban big data offer after all? What other forms of knowledge could it help to produce? Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Liz and Becky and everyone at the Radcliffe Institute. I'm so happy to be back at Radcliffe. I was an undergraduate in the 70s. And I'm going to be speaking about a subject that is dear to my heart, the maximum city I call home, Bombay, the mega city that was renamed Mumbai in 1995 by the right-wing party, Hindu party, Shiv Sena. It's for that reason that I'm going to refer to it in my talk as Bombay and not Mumbai. It's a city which has a density of more than 44,000 people per kilometer and a population of over 18 million. All of us jammed into an area that is only 233 square miles. Though I've written screenplays set in the city and directed 2 films, a feature and a VR short, where the city is very much a character, the way I've come to know Bombay is not through my screenplays or my films, but primarily through the act of photography, just me and my one camera. I began shooting the city in 1976, and I haven't stopped since then. My photographic journey began here in Cambridge in 1976 with a loan of $220 from my roommate, Kathy Dement, God bless her, always, to buy my first camera, a Nicomat with a 50mm lens. I worked with Steve Giovannis in the music library. He was a junior and a stringer for the Boston Globe. He taught me the basics of how to shoot and develop and print. Shortly after I got my camera and lenses and got my lessons from Steve and repaid Kathy, I took a leave of absence for a semester and returned home, ostensibly to spend a semester photographing Bombay, but in reality because I was just desperately homesick. My talk is going to be more showing than telling because I believe that the act of looking is as good a way of knowing a city as any other. This was one of the photos I took on that first trip home. It's the gateway of India from the sea lounge of the Taj Mahal Hotel, 32 years before terrorists held it hostage for 5 extremely bloody, brutal days. Now, of course, there can be no open windows because of security. No matter how modern an Indian city is, there are never any boundaries between inside and outside. These horse carriages used to be symbolic of the city. Now they are banned, except for a few who take tourists on rides, much like in New York City. The lifeline of the city, its local trains. Though this was taken in 1976, the tracks remain the same. This building still exists next to a train station. Our neighborhood bar serving moonshine that is long gone. In its place is a 35-story building, empty of residents, like most of these new buildings are, that are bought for investments. Nobody lives in them. Though this was taken in 1976, many wells still exist in the city. Water is always a valuable and scarce resource everywhere in India. This photograph is the equivalent of 2 kids riding a camel down Mass Ave. They are on one of the city's main arterial roads, Marine Drive. So when I returned home, I also started photographing my family, my grandmother, my grandfather on his favorite trip to get his fountain pens repaired. He always left a tip. My neighbor across the way, Yasmin Irani, studying on her balcony. I call this photo Evenings at Cozy Building. This was where I grew up in an extended family and where my parents still live. This was a typical scene at home every evening. I call this photo Street Side Services, and this was actually taken only last year. It's a typist typing out something for someone on an actual manual typewriter. And this is Street Side Services from 1976. A palmist reads someone's hand, and behind him, a lawyer is in his open-air office consulting. Again, but this time more recently, Bombay's famous road, Marine Drive, lined with Art Deco buildings, and this was at a public air show. These were innocent times when this gentleman could be a security guard at the airport, and I, as a skinny 19-year-old, could be a security guard at Harvard, guarding the chemistry labs at night. Bombay is a city of infinite variety, of worlds within worlds, of different classes, communities, religions, rituals. I grew up with girls who were Christians, Jews, Hindus, Muslims, Jains. I was a Parsi Zoroastrian myself. This is Sean Ma, the son of my husband's college friend, Lang Ma. They live opposite the Chinese temple of Bombay, and we visit their home and the temple every Chinese New Year. Though I come from an extremely collective society, in my creative work, I've always been interested in the individual within the collective, like in this photo. The women of the red light district, Kamatipura. The celebration the city is most known for, the Ganpati festival of the much beloved Hindu god Ganesh, who is immersed in the sea. Then in 1986, I began my film journey with my first screenplay I ever wrote for the film Salaam Bombay, a collaboration with my friend, also from Radcliffe, Meera Nair. The film was about street children in Bombay, and I'm very proud of my unique credit on that film, screenwriter/still photographer. This was taken at an actor's workshop we held before filming began. This is Bernard, a street kid, who was then adopted by a cinematographer, Sandy Sissel. Bernard moved to Los Angeles in 1992 and began living there. He's married to a wonderful Chinese lady, and they have a 13-year-old daughter who is a national-level competitive ice skater. And Bernard has been living in Hollywood for the past so many years, since 1992, and he's been working at, appropriately enough, Panavision. Time pass, a unique Indian concept. All these hundreds of people have so much time to pass that they're all staring up at us shooting on the second floor of a building. Except there's nothing to see because the set was boarded up to keep sound out. This is our sound man, Neil, on location, hard at work. The gang of street kids we hung out with before I wrote the screenplay. The boy on the right looks like such a toughie, but once his cap was off, it was another story. The boy touching his bald head is who inspired the main character of the film. He's the real Chai Pao, the tea boy. The Bombay film industry was always known for its elaborate hand-painted hoardings. They don't exist anymore. A famous artist, M.F. Hussain, began his career as a painter of these hoardings. Two thespians enjoying a well-deserved cup of tea after a bout of artificial rain. Nasiruddin Shah and Stellan Skarsgård shooting for the film Perfect Murder on the streets. Bombay used to have glamorous movie premieres in gorgeous Art Deco movie theaters. This was one of the last of the grand premieres in the 80s with the Navy band playing. The star of the film, Feroz Khan, and the red carpet of those days where you could be much closer to the action. Ever since I was a waitress at the Hong Kong bar and restaurant here on Mass Ave, I've always paid attention to waiters and waitresses. This photo and the next were taken more recently, last year. This was taken at a film festival after party in one of the city's richest residences. I imagine the mistress of the house instructed her staff to clean up immediately any of her guests dropped anything, even if it was in the middle of the party. A New Year's Eve dance in the 80s, again Bombay's mosaic of Christians, Parsis, Sikhs, all rocking and rolling. Unfortunately, its cosmopolitan character has since eroded. Of all Indian cities, women are freer and safer in Bombay, as you can see in this photo. And the classic trope all over the world, and particularly in India, the loose woman partying with a cigarette and smoking versus the goddess. Bombay has always been known as the city by the sea. Countless generations of citizens, regardless of caste, class, and community, have enjoyed the many seafronts that line our coasts. Even if one lives in the interiors, in the most overcrowded of localities, there's always the sea to give relief. This is about to change forever. Thanks to a misguided mega project to build a 12-lane coastal road using public funds that will only benefit a small percentage of car owners. A road that will damage the environment and make the sea a distant dream that once was. My favorite bird, the smartest as well, a Bombay crow. Rear window in Bombay. So that was Bombay then, and I'm going to show you Mumbai now. I'm not going to speak because I'd like you to just look. And could we dim the lights, please? that's it. Thank you so much.
So thank you to all three of our presenters for their provocative and also very compelling presentations. And now we'll try to pull things together just for a few minutes before we open up the floor to your questions. And it's actually not very easy to pull things together because on the one hand, we have Heidi's work and Sooni's, both of which come out of a very long relationship with a particular place, and also using different media, and not exclusively for artistic purposes, but certainly those are among the purposes. And then we have Mark's work, which shows how we can use the same media or similar newer media, not in representational modes, but in modes that allow us to mine data from them. And Mark also observes that what we see is conditioned by the lens that we use, which in turn affects us. So, without getting too tangled up in the idea of new technologies, I wonder if we can somehow put the two approaches together in terms of what they yield. So I would like to ask each of our three speakers to comment on the kinds of knowledge and understanding about urbanism today that are produced by their work, and through what artistic strategies the particular power of your medium shows change over time. So that's my question to each of you in turn. And I don't know, perhaps you'd like to.
Well, I haven't really thought about it in those terms. I think that the difference between sort of, I think the work that I'm showing versus what you were showing, and also to a lesser extent, we have more in common with what we're doing, but I think that it's interesting that the data can show maybe where these people go and what spaces they inhabit, whereas I'm interested in how an individual relates to and feels about their environment, and what kind of personal stories that they create around a tactile space. And, you know, it's funny because in Detroit, for example, people always talk about the emptiness, the empty spaces, and we were sure in our film to very rarely show just an empty building on a street. There was always a person scurrying by, or someone in the window. We even have a shot in the film where a crane is taking down all these houses as part of the mayor's oath to the people to tear down like 60,000 houses, unoccupied houses, and we would be shooting that, and then just one street behind, there'd be a little kid in the window, maybe the last family on the block. And so there was this push to shrink the city while we were filming. It was when Mayor Bing was the mayor of Detroit, and it was all about shrinking the city and turning off street lights and turning off water and saving money. And if there was only one person on the block, they should move. They should just move, and that would be more practical. But there wasn't money to give them to move, and so it was like, what makes a neighborhood? I mean, there's birds and trees and grass and stray dogs and maybe one old lady on the block, and what is her value? And if there's only one person interacting with a space that was made for multitudes, does the value of that space change? And in the eyes of the lady on the block, it's her whole world, it's her memories, it's her life, it's the smells and sounds of her kids who used to live there. And so for her, it's a hyper-tactile, real living thing. It's her life, it's her memory. And to the city, it's just a nuisance because it wasn't made just for her. So these were the kind of conversations that were happening in the city, and we tried to capture in the way we could through our lens. Which doesn't answer your question, but it's an answer.
Yeah, okay. I'll take a crack at trying to approach it. I think the intention in presenting a kind of talk that I presented in this milieu is really to try to push back to some of the kind of overarching claims that people working in this field of, let's call it smart city development, make about what not only the aspirations are, but what some of the potential capabilities are. And I think that one of the things that we're witnessing as some of these proposals, projects are moving from the realm of speculation to being built or enacted, is that the kind of territory is shrinking, right? In terms of, there's a kind of gap between what something can, or what something is being projected to be capable of, and in fact what it's being really used for, or is useful for. And I think one of the things that people are coming around to is just this notion that specifically this type of work, this so-called small data, right, is extremely valuable to understand the qualitative components or the qualitative aspects of an urban environment. In looking at correlations, not caring about causation, the idea is that you would make discoveries, that you would operate on. I was having a conversation last night about people working with the New York Public Library's digital collection of menus, right? And suddenly, across hundreds of years, or 100, 150 years, I'm not quite sure. But being able to look and try to correlate the presence of grapefruit on a menu with, let's say, droughts in California or supply chain shifts is something that the kind of question that big data enables. The problem is that much like 20th century kind of techno-determinism in urban design in particular, high urban design, there is the drive that this empiricism becomes totalizing. And so in this context, I think it's important to be able to not just look away or say, this is only quantitative information. Cities are far more complex and diverse. They are filled with non-addressable spaces, spaces which aren't easily quantifiable. And within this context, it's important to be able to point to examples where knowledge of ways of knowing the city exceed the ability of any one media or medium and any one discourse, right? And so it's in a sense, a kind of, what kinds of questions do we need to ask from the perspective of the humanities, to be able to engage with what is ultimately a fairly powerful force, right? And to a certain extent is beginning to drive decisions, for example, in Detroit about what parts of the city do we kind of reconfigure urban services, right? Street lights, for example, water, electricity, right? How can we input into this policy-making, decision-making process in ways which can make qualitative difference?
I've always found photography as an ideal medium to document change and preserve memory, especially of things that are disappearing. And that's always been my personal kind of motivator to photograph the city as well as the community I belong to, both of which are disappearing. The city that I knew is disappearing and the community I belong to as well. I was struck by the images of Detroit, and it's funny that it would never happen in my city that there would be spaces that are kind of, derelict and empty, because it just doesn't happen. There is not an inch of empty space in Bombay, and probably in other Indian cities as well. It's always broken down to be built up. Nobody leaves anything derelict ever. And so there's a lot of churning going on in Indian cities, especially Bombay. Bombay is full of change now. It's full of mega development projects. They all involve corruption, including public works. And there are a lot of active citizens who are trying to oppose it to, I'm sorry to say, little or no avail.
We're almost at our discussion period, but I'm just going to take the moderator's prerogative to ask Sooni one more question, which is that the beautiful photographs that she showed us were divided into 2 series, as she herself specified. A first earlier series in black and white, and a second more contemporary series filled with the drama of color, and also with all kinds of contrasts that speak to the contemporary moment. So I wanted to ask about your different strategies and whether you consider it all one body of work or several bodies.
I don't know about considering it one body of work. I think there are 2 bodies of work. The color is actually a result of technology. Most of these were camera phone pictures. And though I'm a purist, I love the camera phone because I always have it with me. And I always used to resolve to carry a camera with me every day, but I never managed to, and now I always have it with me. And the other thing is I'm a very avid Instagrammer because when I started photography, there was very few avenues to share your work. And when Instagram came out and I could share my work with friends across the globe, I completely dived into it. I have some 3,000 plus photos on Instagram, including a lot of these. So it's a question of technology that made the second body of work.
Thank you. All right, so we'd like to give you all a chance to ask questions of our presenters. As you can see, there's a mic in the center of the aisle there. And if you'd like to ask a question, please just come up to the mic. If there are several of you, you can stand in line. And when it's your turn, please identify yourself and please ask a question along with making any comments. So I know it's hard to be the first one, but I can't imagine that some of you don't have questions for these amazing speakers.
Can I go right ahead?
Go for it.
This is a question, well, this is a comment and a question for Sooni. When I was 12 or 13, I was lucky enough to capture or just flick the channel and see Salaam Bombay. And besides the commercials, there always were. I was struck by your movie, and it's been an inspiration for me since then to study cities as a political science major, to look at cities as a civic space that's continuously transforming, and I thank you so much for your art. And I'm definitely going to look for your Instagram because I loved your writing and your storytelling and your photography, and I want to continue that. My question to you is, I'm Bangladeshi. I'm Bangladeshi.
Yeah.
So 3 or 4 years ago, I was working with an NGO called BRAC on water policy in Bangladesh. And Dhaka has been a city that has changed within 10 to 20 years, 10 of which I've never been back. I was born in this country. I consider myself an American. But I have history and roots that obviously go back to being Bengali. So I wonder, when I was passing through the city corporation and seeing this tall building, how people, when growing up in Cambridge and continuing to live in Cambridge, when I can walk up to my city councilor and say, can I make office hours with you? Can I talk about a city ordinance with you? How do we bring that without, keeping in mind the differences between and the stereotypes that are associated with democracy and westernization? How do we bring that kind of openness? How do we bring that civic conversation back to our people and integrate our values and culture and history into what we can transform our cities and our way of life? Thank you.
It's a good question. I wish I had the answer. I would love to know the answer to that because, we had one avenue in India called the RTI Act, which is Right to Information, and now the current government wants to repeal that as well. So nothing is public. In my city, Bombay, they will have a development act, and they will do it, and then they will make it public for 5 days of public comments and the act will have such far-reaching consequences. And it would never happen in any Western city, but it happens constantly in India because there's no accountability, there's no feeling that they are accountable to the public. Politicians feel that they're almost like royalty. Nobody can question them. And there's a huge amount of corruption involved in all these projects, in all these public projects. So I'm sorry to be so pessimistic about it, but realistically speaking, I don't know when it's going to change, really.
Yeah.
And this, what I talked about, this coastal road, we tried very hard, but we didn't get anywhere, unfortunately.
Well, thank you anyway.
And thank you for your kind words about Salaam Bombay.
Thank you so much. I have a query beginning with Mark. In your comment about empiricism becoming totalizing, and I think in your engagement, there is a deep yearning for the non-totalitarian and the creative. So it is in that spirit, the discourse of the smart city, how does it cultivate the vision and practice of a soul city? And I'm here reminded of the great work of anthropologist Ulf Hannes, who nearly 50 years ago wrote a book called The Soul Side. So how do we think of the urban space as a sphere of the soul sphere as well? My connected query to both Heidi and Sooni is, thank you so much. Among your many important engagement, one dimension is the engagement with loss and disappearance. And therefore, ways of knowing the city, especially when Sooni, you make the comment, seeing as a way of knowing, but that act of seeing, does it also involve an act of weeping or crying? Therefore, I think with the theme of loss and disappearance, how do we bring weeping as a way of knowing, which then becomes a companion to solidarity? Therefore, the question would be that what is the space of hope in this context, and how do we think of the city space in terms of poetics of space, but also the emergent spaces of hope?
If I can just to take the first question, can you just repeat the author? I'm not sure I'm familiar with this text.
He's an anthropologist. His name is Ulf Hannes, originally from Sweden, who did field work with, I think, an Afro-American community in Washington, D.C. But I am just reminded of the title Soul Side.
Soul Side,
so
yeah.
Just to bring the connection of the soul sphere, because in my work, I'm also I'm coming from India, and with the kind of as Sooni mentioned, the regal discourse of the smart city. Yeah. So we need to bring a discourse of the soul city.
Sure, yeah. That's a great question. There's a couple of ways one can respond to that, or people have responded to that. One is to say simply that the soul side of the city is a non-addressable space. At least it's not addressable in the sense that it doesn't have an IP address, right? The soul doesn't have an IP address, right? And to a certain extent, one finds that response unsatisfying. Another way of responding to that is to suggest, in a similar way that we were talking about this morning, where people move to the city and it changes them, right? Their attitudes change, their values change in some respects, or at least grow, develop. I think back to Martin Heidegger's essay on the age of the world picture, and he's talking about this quantification and in the age of the world picture, the certain move or shift toward a degree of shall I say, bigness, right, which moves over from the quantitative to begin to have a qualitative component to it, or has a quality to it, right? And he describes this as a kind of modern condition, and as a result from a whole range of technological developments. Similar claims are being made about how, and this is the kind of darker side, in a sense, of some of the propositions, Chris Anderson's claim of the end of theory, right, where correlation supersedes causation. We're talking about a different. It's in the sciences, in the hard sciences, it's not such a leap to say, Well, we don't really care why this is happening, but we can show you, right, evidentiary data that prove this correlation exists, right? When we're talking about the soul side, right, it's a question of, has that quality, right, which comes from a quantitative condition being pushed to a certain scale, already become part of us, right? And I think that's the challenge, right? That's what we're looking at.
I think it's so evocative, the concept of weeping and acknowledging the loss of what is no longer coming back, and that there is a crying and there's a weeping that I think you could feel in some of the clips I showed today. Spaces matter and neighborhoods matter, and where things take place matters, especially in a city like Detroit, which, not unlike what Angela was mentioning about Los Angeles, the highways, the freeways, the way they were built in Detroit also completely segregated blacks from whites in Detroit. It was intentional. It was done with the concept in mind, was to just keep everyone apart. And it's very, very hard to undo an infrastructure like that, even with good intentions. The city planning was done a certain way. And that has not been resolved. So when we talk about all the development happening in this one area, now they call it Midtown, that is accessible, easily accessible by suburban people. So they come into the Tigers games on the weekends, they'll come to the opera, they'll go to the Detroit Institute of Arts, they'll go to these places, it's easy to get there, there's parking. And for a lot of black residents who live in the greater Detroit city, which is a huge, massive place, it's not convenient, it's expensive. They don't feel comfortable, all the development and all the new residents are mostly white. So in a way, it's like recreating the problem that was never solved the first time around. And so I think that in order to help bridge this divide, they should start with the spaces that events are held in. There is a lot of foundations right now in Detroit, sort of NGO type money flowing into the city. And always when they're invited to an event, it happens at the Detroit Institute of Art, or it happens at the Masonic Temple, or a known space in this Midtown area, because they think it's going to be convenient to those people interested. If they moved those events and said, I'm doing it at Baker's Keyboard Lounge, completely other side of town, or if I'm doing it at the Raven on the east side on Shane Street, and you partnered with these older black local businesses that have credibility with their neighborhoods, if they work together to get the word out that there's going to be meetings in unexpected places, and vice versa, I think that would go a long way to the longtime residents not feeling left out of this new Detroit and cut out and forgotten, it makes you feel, it makes people feel useless and disrespected, and also there's this sense of history that this racial divide is just being recreated again. So I actually really think some of these changes have to happen with where events and invitations are made in Detroit. It's that simple, and that has not even been done. I mean, that's how basic we're talking.
I'm going to answer your question about hope. There's certainly no hope for the politicians, but I have a lot of hope because of what I've seen with the people of the city, of my city, when there are disasters like floods, how people react, how, you must have seen in these photographs, a woman who has no home, who has her everything outdoors, and she's still smiling. That's what gives me hope. It gives me hope that people who have nothing still continue to smile and still continue to have hope. And that's an amazing thing, and that exists in the city, and that I think nobody can destroy. And the other hope of the city is people are constantly coming to the city, because for them, the city represents hope as opposed to villages where they are starving. And they say that nobody starves in the city. I'm not sure how true that is, but that's what they say.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Pallavi Mande. I'm a Loeb Fellow at the Graduate School of Design this year. Otherwise, I reside in the world of cities and water, be it climate change or restoration or river systems. So having followed some of your work, Sooni, I've obviously seen the film, very intrigued by the dystopic view of Detroit, and I've only anecdotally heard a lot around water infrastructure and how that intersects with issues of people leaving and the community, the real estate interests sort of giving this brand of the Renaissance and the white flight into Detroit, and really issues around accountability and how we actually ensure that what happened in Flint doesn't become a phenomenon that a lot of cities in the US are just waiting to witness. So my question really is, if I ground this discourse in the field of resilience, which is also becoming a very hot discourse area, and how it intersects with urbanism. Sooni, since you mentioned, Mumbai and, the opportunities, even though there's no physical space for these opportunities to play out in a conventional sort of design, architecture, or urbanism standpoint, I wonder how we, as a community looking at cities from different expertise or disciplines, how we want to acknowledge the opportunity to tell the stories that need to be told, sort of represent realities in ways that are not convenient, or even, for that matter, constructive. And I really want to open it up to whoever wants to take a pass at how can we tell the stories, not to just sort of make the world be aware of realities, but address it in a way that's universally applicable, but also challenging for this discourse to inform us in how we want to move forward.
Well, if I understood correctly, it's always as documentaries, we're often asked to be also activists and, to use our work for a specific purpose. And we've always sort of evaded sort of the agenda film and tying our movies in a bow at the end. Like, there's a whole trend of documentary filmmaking where at the end it's like, if you want to help, turn off your faucet and, turn off your light. These are the things that you can do. Go to this website and you can, and I think that's great. Our works never fit into those boxes, so sometimes we do reveal inconvenient truths and don't offer solutions, which can frustrate people. But what I think is really important, at least in my medium, is that to partner with organizations that have the will and the resources to make a curriculum, for example. Like, several of my films are taught in schools and universities, and we helped make a curriculum or made it easy for people to make a curriculum in Canada and elsewhere. How do we teach this film? How do we make your film or your photograph into a tool for other people who do have ideas, solutions, and agendas? So, for example, I made a film called 12th in Delaware, about the abortion battle. It's on HBO, this film, raging on a street corner in Fort Pierce, Florida. So on one side of the street, there's an abortion clinic. On the other side of the street, there's a crisis pregnancy center, which is basically a fake abortion clinic. Women think they're in an abortion clinic because they're getting a free pregnancy test, but it's actually a pro-life front where they will give an ultrasound to the girl and tell her she'll get breast cancer if she has an abortion, or tell her that she's not as far along as she is, so that by the time she figures it out, it's too late to get an abortion in her state. So we got inside one of this crisis pregnancy center and filmed. And then we got inside the abortion clinic, and it's a character-driven film about this one street corner and the battle, the abortion battle. Now, what we've done with that film is when we were finished with it, we've allowed NARAL and Planned Parenthood to use it for their events. And as long as we don't have great disagreements with what they're doing with the film, we happily hand it over. So I think that that is really how we can get our messages out, and also interpreted by different people in different ways, so that you can actually reach more people and start using our work for more concrete solutions.
One filmmaker said, if you want to send a message, go to UPS or FedEx. And so I kind of agree with that and kind of don't, because after we made Salaam Bombay, we started an organization for street kids called Salaam Bombay Trust that is still very active, I don't know how many years later. I think film is an easier way to be an activist than a still photographer. There have been still photographers who've been activists and who've been working for change, but I don't think that is my primary goal when I take photographs. I take photographs because I'm just obsessive about putting frames around reality. I don't know why, I think I was born like that. So, but in the films that I make, there's definitely some food for thought and hope that things will change.
So we have 1 minute left, but these two people have been very patiently standing online. Is there a way for you to very quickly ask your question?
I mean, I can ask it as fast as I can.
Yeah, as fast as you possibly can.
Sure. Hi, thank you so much for sharing your work. My question is about nostalgia. I think in the films, it's very clear when nostalgia comes up. I think with data, it's less clear. I'm interested in how data talks about nostalgia. Does data talk about nostalgia? And I'm also curious how cities, when we change cities, when we try to be purposeful about change, how do we use nostalgia? Is it useful? And whose nostalgia do we use?
In 1 minute. Well, that's a great question. This is characteristics of the kinds of questions, I think, the kinds of more interesting questions that are being asked about data today. And I guess, the one thing I could say is that nostalgia is being looked at, and but it's more how can data and analytics operate on the objects of nostalgia? So it would be about archives, looking at, and to what extent can it reveal something or discover correlations or relationships which aren't, which we don't already know about nostalgia. In 1 minute.
Okay. Were you?
Yeah, I would think.
Did you have more to say?
No, I was.
If you can quantify nostalgia with data, I mean, call me. I'd love to see that. It's so fascinating. I mean, I thought it was interesting, actually, looking at Angela's sort of the streetcar map versus the subway map. Something about that, just seeing them next to each other, and all that was lost when the streetcars were removed from those black neighborhoods. I surprisingly found that effective, and that was just a graph. Yeah. So actually, I think it's intriguing, the idea that you can move people emotionally with data. I think that's an interesting area.
But I would also like to conclude with an argument for very small data, because humanists are very good at close reading. And so Heidi and I were speaking about the title of her film, and Detropia. And for me, there are all these associations that come out of just that one term, like utopia, dystopia, cornucopia, detritus, deteriorate, opia, hope. It just feels, and I suppose nostalgia as well. But so it feels as though somehow our task is to balance vast, sort of even unimaginable quantities of data, along with the incredible importance of very small things. So let's conclude on that. Thank you to our 3 presenters for their wonderful talks, and thank you to you for your attention.